Morning everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes to kick off, so we'll start just after 11. But yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
Right. Hi guys, thank you for joining today's webinar titled Don't Get Caught in the Crossfire, the Anatomy of a Supply Chain Attack. The session is recorded, so please consider that when you have any questions of a sensitive nature. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the session, and let's get started with some introductions. So first of all, Tom.
So I'm Tom. I'm one of the lead engineers here at Clarinet. I work in the SOC, so I'm primarily here to talk about what we do and what we see from a defensive point of view. I've worked in security now for nearly 10 years. 5 of those have been building SOCs, developing SOCs and running SOCs. So I'm here to really talk about how I see these attacks and this problem from a defensive point of view, what we can do around defense and how we can hopefully take this problem and really work it going forward. Jed.
Brilliant, thanks Tom. So my name is Jed Kafetz and I'm the cyber practice lead at Clarinet. In the cyber practice, we do pen testing, risk consultancy and continuous security testing. I started my career in pen testing and then moved into red teaming and then offensive security management. I've also recently joined the UK CREST Council, although it won't be official until maybe 2 more weeks until the first meeting, but that'll be me representing industry requirements to industries like airline industry, finance, banking, to gather their cybersecurity requirements and help CREST get talent, get exams to help people and companies like us up to that talent level. At Clarinet, we've got huge pen testing firepower. We are CREST registered and we've got hundreds of dedicated security consultants across the group. So today, what are we talking about? Hopefully, we tell some type of story going from your external infrastructure, which might seem a bit simple, and then we're discussing, okay, so what is your supply chain on your external infrastructure? What happens in the event that one of these pieces of software gets breached? So talk a bit about the zero-day life cycle. And then we go on to a little bit talking about the threat. Who is the threat and what do they do? The reason being is every organization upsets different people or has a different threat. For example, it might be nation state threat, it might be ransomware, it might be script kiddies, and they all have different threat groups targeting them for different reasons. And therefore, if there are different threat groups, what do they do differently in terms of disruption? And then we were kind of linking back to the zero-day life cycle and what you can do to protect yourselves, and then go through any questions at the end. So if that's all right, we'll crack on with the external facing infrastructure, and that's Tom.
So I wanted to take this slide really to talk about what I see as a problem, and maybe problem is the wrong word here, but what I see and what we've seen across sort of at least the past 3 years, but in the years preceding that, was a shift away from what we consider to be your standard IT world and your standard IT infrastructure, where everything was in the walled garden, everything was hosted internally, you managed all the systems, you patched all your own systems, and everything existed behind a firewall or was in a DMZ that you controlled. And what you saw was this push to go to more of the SaaS, the IaaS and the PaaS world, and moving things away. And there's a lot of benefit from that. There's cost benefits in certain cases. There's less overhead needed. It was a very smart way to go. But it opened up a whole new world of attacks. It opened up a whole new attack surface. So when we saw the pandemic and things like that, there was an even greater push to move outside of the office, to move outside of the infrastructure, because it was no longer going to be there anymore. We could no longer rely on having someone sat behind a firewall or someone sat there. You could do things with VPNs, but it didn't always work in certain situations. So we see this going on, and this problem is never going away. We see new things coming across. IoT is going to be a massive thing in the next couple of years, not just in what we'd see possibly traditional industries that would have IoT, sort of your OT networks, your operational networks in sort of heavy industry. We're going to see IoT move into a lot more things as it creeps into not just home life with things like thermostats and everything else. We see it move into things where businesses are going to start deploying IoT. We're going to see a lot more things with IoT. And again, it just expands this net and expands our attack surface and can lead to big problems when it comes to things like patching, when it comes to things like supply chain, and when it starts to come to things like how we can secure these networks. And also, how do we give visibility to people in the SOC? How can I give visibility to people who depend on this? Because not all of these systems have native logging. Not all of these systems were built with logging in mind. They were built with usability customization in mind, but some cases logging or a method of being able to have robust logging is an afterthought. And where I sit in the defensive world, that's probably going to be one of my biggest problems going forward. How am I going to get this and how am I going to stop this? But how can I lean on other parts of the business to provide wrappers around these, so logging isn't the be all and end all, my defensive strategy isn't the be all and end all. We can start to overlay a lot of other things to be able to control this risk. Jed.
Thanks, Tom. We're on the next slide, sorry.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So external infrastructure. What is your external infrastructure? Now, this might seem as though I'm teaching you guys to suck eggs, but please give me some rope for a moment. The question I have for you is, do you frequently assess your internet-facing infrastructure? Assuming the answer is yes, my follow-up question would be, how do you know you've got full coverage of all your internet-facing assets? And how can you confirm that on a regular basis? Now, the reason for these questions is that for SME, for SMB, for sub-enterprise size organizations, as Tom was saying, with your expanding digital estate, your external infrastructure pulses every month. You might be introducing new applications to your organization, bringing IoT devices online. It's very frequent for companies to be acquired and to be sold. For example, Clarinet, sub-enterprise, and we grow by acquisition, so our external facing infrastructure across the group is changing every month or so. We have office locations opening up. And also, the thing that everyone forgets is disaster recovery IPs. I've had a 2 or 3 years ago had an instance where a Pulse Secure VPN for a large hedge fund company, they got breached, they got lit up the SOC, and we were looking at that Pulse Secure and it's saying it's absolutely fine, but it turned out to be on a disaster recovery server farm that the Pulse Secure hadn't been patched, and therefore attackers were able to get into it and got onto the network that way. So for every set of IPs from your first broadband connection or internet connection, there's always a disaster recovery, and you make sure you're testing both ranges. So the point I'm trying to make here is that your external infrastructure is changing all the time. You need processes in place to address this, to identify that it does change. And this is really your kind of current biggest threat to your external infrastructure. And we have kind of off-the-shelf products that are on your external infrastructure, and that's kind of what we mean by supply chain. If we can click to the next slide, Tom. So what do we mean by supply chain? So if you use FortiGate for your firewalls, or if you use a CCTV provider or a file sharing platform, these all form part of your supply chain. Now, I'm not strictly talking about whether FortiGate get breached. I'm talking about if there's a vulnerability on a firewall and that firewall is exploitable, that's also counted and considered as part of your supply chain. So the next question I'm thinking or I'm asking is, regardless of the effective vulnerability management, regardless of whether you do scan your external infrastructure, the question I have is, you might have good patching, but is good patching good enough? Is your patching policy within 13 days? Is it within 30 days? Is it within 14 days? Is it still a concern? And to answer that, we've got the next slide. So we've got the 0-day life cycle. Now, this slide was inspired by a book written by a lady called Nicola Perloff, who I very much recommend everyone on this webinar reads. It's called "This is How They Tell Me the World Ends." Nicola Perloff is a cybersecurity editor for the New York Times, and she wrote a book that talks about the first cyber security breach called Project Gunman, where they intercepted typewriter translations in the 1960s and 1970s in the Cold War, through to Project Aurora, which happened in 2010, where the Chinese breached Google, and up to very much, not quite present day, but more like 2021, where Russia was still using Ukraine as a kind of POC testing ground for their testing cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So what I want to kind of draw you to is the life cycle of a 0-day. And the kind of standout fact is that once these 0 days are identified, they can last on your network for about 7 years. I think the average, in the book, it said the average time of a 0-day lives for 7 years. MS-17010 was being exploited actively by government and threat actors for 7 years before it was patched. So these vulnerabilities are identified on the black market, or they're and perhaps sold to either nation states or APT groups or ransomware groups. And then they're in active exploitation. And then I suppose the more low-level gangs will start to use it. And when the low-level gangs start to use it, that's when the vendors kind of are aware or alerted to the vulnerability. And there's a short window from when it gets patched, and when the patch gets released, there's a window before the patch release and everyone installs it. It could be 1 or 2 days, it could be 3 or 4 days, it could be 15 days, where everyone's very vulnerable to it. Now, the APT groups, the ransomware groups, they have automation like we do to protect our networks and our clients' networks. So they're ready to go with automation to find some vulnerable piece of software, be it firewalls, be it Pulse Secure, be it Citrix vulnerabilities, in their factory of creating 0 days. And essentially they can be as quick as us to immobilize and start breaching essentially the internet.
And I think it's a good point as well, because it's what we see in the defensive world. I mean, traditionally, when we would see attacks or things like that, there would be a lag in our time. You know, the MS-17 one is a really good example. MS-18, and forgive me, I can't remember the full number, but the exploit that eventually became Eternal Blue, which was then used by WannaCry, you had about a window of 30, 60 days before WannaCry became a thing, from when the exploit was leaked by the shadow brokers and then was patched by Microsoft. But that exploit was known by the NSA for years and used to great effect by the NSA for years. So that sits very nicely in the 7-year period where a 0 day is known about, but locked away and used as a tool by someone, whether that's government, whether that's a threat actor or whatever else. When it gets leaked, it gets patched, and then you started to see this lag before it was being used. And anecdotally, I think what I'm seeing now is that window between POC, patch, and then exploitation is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter. And what you're starting to see now is ransomware gangs almost using or becoming their own researchers. MoveIt is a really good example, which was sort of the exploit that spawned the idea of this webinar, was when we were discussing the MoveIt vulnerability internally. MoveIt was a 0 day that was discovered by a ransomware gang and then used to exfiltrate data. So there was no patch, there was nothing. It was being exploited straight away. You see something similar quite recently with the same vendor of software, had a product called WSFTP. There was an exploit that was released on the 4th of October. By the afternoon of the 4th of October, it was being actively exploited. We were able to see traffic coming in. We were able to see exploits being done. We were able to see successful exploits being done. And what was really interesting from that is the time it was taking. And these were, like Jed said, automated processes that were happening now. So you could see that these attacks were coming from automated things because commands were being issued within milliseconds of each other, and nobody can type that fast on a keyboard. So automation is becoming a massive thing, not only in our world in IT, but also in how threat actors work and how they are able to exploit things en masse, because they want to be able to hit 50, 60, 70 companies all in one time. It's not really possible to do that with a human, but it's very possible to do that with things like mass scripting, mass scanning, and bits like that. So when we talk about a 0 day, I think it's interesting to see that this timeline is becoming more and more and more condensed. And as we go to more and more things like SaaS solutions and bits like that, the common factors are going to become more and more repeatable. You know, people are going to go and find a solution for a problem. Typically, that vendor is going to then provide more and more solutions to that company. The attack surface becomes wider and wider. We're going to see more of these problems happen, and we're going to see this time frame become shorter and shorter and shorter, particularly around the POC exploitation stage all the way to patch release. Getting that time shorter and shorter and making sure that we repeat that patching cycle internally is going to be absolutely critical in resolving this problem around supply chain and around what we're doing around our software. So I touched on it a little bit, but going through some of these sort of noteworthy breaches, a lot of these came from the supply chain. These were pieces of software that were bought, or these are SaaS solutions that have been procured and that have then been used to exploit organizations. You know, if I look at SolarWinds, which is probably the largest well-known attack that's happened quite recently, software was broken, exploited, and compromised at the vendor level. The vendor then sent those updates down into customers and subsequently compromised them. That was a massive seismic shift in how I thought about attacks, and I think how a lot of people thought attacks. There was a lot of mudslinging around that time to say, wow, you know, this should have been done and this should have been done. But the reality of it is, IT teams and security teams internally are overstretched. Not everyone can protect against these threats. It's not reasonable to protect against some of these threats. But what we can do is try to control our supply chain, control how we are having this software, where it's exposed, what we're going to do around patching, how we deal with patching, but also how we deal with our own internal risk management and our own internal risk profile. We start to look at some other things. Log4j was a very good example as well that happened later on, which was an exploit, but it kind of hammers home how quickly it went from a post online, a proof of concept online, to mass exploitation. And Log4j still is a thing. It's still something that happens. It's still exploitable out there in the wild. If I look at my honeypots that I've got scattered around the world, Log4j is still scanned tens of thousands, if not millions of times a day. So we move a little bit to the script kiddie side, but it's still a vulnerability that's out there in the wild, and it's still something that people are going to try and actively exploit. If we start looking to more recent ones, we've got the MoveIt vulnerability, we've got the WS FTP vulnerability, but then we also have things like typo squatting. So where we talk about NPM, so these are packet managers and things like that, typo squatting is becoming more prevalent. We start to see quite a lot of blogs and research written around people intentionally setting up malicious packages in Python or NPM for Node or for other package managers. There was a recent piece of research done by Huntress Online, and they were looking at VS Code. So VS Code you can download extensions for straight from their marketplace. How many of those are typo squatted, or how many of those are potentially malicious? The number is actually quite high. But that's a piece of trusted software inside an organization that can then be backdoored through users' interactions. And it all comes under this supply chain and trying to understand where your risks are and where your potential breaches are, rather than just thinking solely in terms of what is a CVE or what is an exploit. So I want to hand over to Jed a little bit on what we can do around defending these and being able to detect these, and then I'll touch a little bit on sort of how you can wrap this through things like zero trust.
Thanks, Tom. If you can build the slide, that'd be great. It's been a bit slow for me. So the question is perfect. That's great. So from the right to left, we have script kiddies, patch release, software vendors informed, POC exploitation. What tools can we use to defend ourselves at which point? So for when the patch is being released, you've got vulnerability scanners and pen testing will detect whether your systems are vulnerable. This could be introductions of web apps or another internet connected device. Pen testing, unless you're really lucky, will not go and find 0 days in off-the-shelf packages. It will essentially find out, are you running a vulnerable version, and if and how exploitable is that version. I mean, there are some exploits that, for example, web servers, that it might say you've got a high impact vulnerability, but when you look into it, it's only a module of that web server that gets used 1% of the time. And therefore, your vulnerability scan will say high critical, where in actual fact, the risk is minimal to none. So how do you defend yourself against the stage of a 0-day life cycle between the POC and the patch release? Now, this is when threat intelligence and vendor update feeds come into its own. Both of these are considered a source of potential 0-day information. It might be the case that the vulnerabilities are patched before they're made public. This is the best case. The worst case is that they make the BBC News before they're patched. Now, this week, going off script here, Tom, but this week and last week, sorry, there was a great instance of this. Last week, we were made aware of a vulnerability in a software package called curl, C-U-R-L. For those that don't know what curl is, it allows essentially any API, any website to make web requests without using a browser. And we were alerted last Tuesday of a high impact vulnerability being released yesterday through the release of a patch. Now, it does transpire that we had no information about the patch, we had no information about what the vulnerability was. Now, it transpired that the vulnerability was related to, again, 5% of curl's capabilities. And from Tom and I's analysis, only really affects people that use the dark web and Tor. Have you got any more up-to-date information on that, Tom? Briefly.
I think the curl one is an interesting one because curl is, unless you are somewhat technical or something like that, you're probably not going to interact with curl in its command line form. I use curl for downloading packages and scraping things, but I think if you're not a technical person, you're never going to interact with it. But curl makes up a massive, I think the number that came from curl was it's installed on something like 20 billion devices globally. A mildly interesting fact about curl is it's a software package that operates on 2 planets. Curl is used in Mars rovers to download and upload packages and information. So that's a minor gimmick from the piece of software. But the thing I'm trying to hammer home there is curl is potentially everywhere in different areas. Now, this vulnerability was quite niche. It could only be exploited if you were using curl behind a SOC 5 proxy, you were using remote DNS. But when I started to look at that, I go, well, why would I be sat behind a proxy and using curl? Well, Tor uses SOC 5 proxies or can be used for SOC 5 proxies. So actually, when I look at things that potential attack surface, I start to think more towards the dark web and places that you'd be behind Tor. SOC 5 exists in enterprise as well, so it's not without concern there, but it was a mildly interesting point that we thought about around, well, actually, this might affect attackers and threat actors more than it would possibly affect us in the sort of the enterprise sub-enterprise space. So it's kind of an interesting fact around Tor. But again, it's another thing where we knew about this vulnerability a week ago. There was a lot of hype around it because it's a heap overflow. It is a severe vulnerability, but actually its exploitation becomes quite niche. There was another instance of that. I think it was either early this year or late last year around OpenSSL. A similar problem. It was a high vulnerability, but actually the chances of exploiting it were quite small. But again, it's this shrinking of life cycle, and that particular curl exploit, I think, had lived in the code since 2014. So again, it's been there a long time. Nobody had found it before, or we think nobody had found it before.
Yeah, and I think if that vulnerability was more severe, I think the contents of this webinar will be very different.
I think I'd be very busy.
Yeah, but I suppose on to the next point, the sector between zero-day research and POC exploitation. For most businesses, with the exception of businesses with billion-dollar budgets, you're very unlikely to find your own 0 days in the software that you have. You really have to rely on researchers, on patches to be released and update the patches. If you want like a special forces style software reverse engineering team, absolutely be my guest. But we don't think regular organizations, especially those that Clarinet sell to, have that capability or budgets. But there is more you can do. There is defense in depth. Now, my methods are more reactive. Defense in depth is definitely more proactive. Hopefully Tom could talk a bit about how you can use defense in depth to prevent yourself across the entire spectrum from 0 day to POC to patch release to script kiddies and active exploitation.
It's an interesting point as well, because how I've always approached this problem of defending, particularly in environments where there maybe is not any logging or any form of defense before, you know, the customer is, or the client is very early on in their evolution of their cyber practices internally. It's, you look at a system and just assume breach, and that's where you start to see it going into defense in depth, which is, I've always assumed breach when I look at environment and when I try to understand an environment. And then if I now look to defend an environment, I go to the level of, well, I don't trust anything. Unless I know exactly what that thing is doing, then I don't trust it. So I need to build a network, or I need to change a network, or I need to change ideas and policies around trusting nothing. And to go along the, you know, the full end of that, that's probably a very expensive journey to go down, and it's be a very time expensive and potentially monetary expensive project to do. But what you can do is start to take steps in that. You can start to move towards that goal and evolve and redefine internal practices very easily. You know, it's about moving to newer technologies where possible. So things like EDR. It's a very simple switch to go from a legacy product like Symantec SEP, or look at something like Sentinel-1. It's a fairly drag and drop replacement, but the benefits and the visibility are exponentially better than they were in the legacy product. So that's a shift. We now have better visibility. You then start to bolt on things like MDR because you want to centralize more logs. You want to gain better visibility. And then that starts to go hand in hand with, what do my people need access to? Do I need to go to things like JIT, just-in-time access? Do I need to look at PIM, privileged identity management? Do I need to start looking at things like POR, privileged access workstations, things like that? How can I start to reduce my access? How can I start to containerize things? If someone needs to perform an administrative action on a machine, they do it on a special machine. They do it on a separate account. So if a piece of software gets exploited on that machine, the blast radius has shrunk. We're no longer talking about having the entire system in scope. We're no longer talking about having the entire network in scope. We're containerizing these different areas. You saw it a lot with PCI DSS when that first came in, because one of the problems was you had card data being effectively sent across an entire network at any one point in time. PCI DSS came in with the idea of a card data environment and securing a card data environment. What you start to see now is that same model being applied across the entire network. And we used to do this in the old world. We used to do this quite well in the old world to some extent with VLANs. You know, it's as simple as segregating certain parts of the network away from each other. But when we move to this expanded estate and this more SaaS-based and things like that, it's about looking at these things as separate pieces and what can we do around securing that access. Do I need people to have global administrator on my Azure 24/7? No. I can use a break glass account and I can monitor that break glass account, and I can move to things like PIM to limit the time that an administrator has access. So if they are breached or they are compromised, their access is time restricted and limited to a certain time. So I don't have to worry particularly about access being extended. I can put extra monitoring around those accounts. I can put extra monitoring around my PIM, but I can start to build my security layer by layer, segregating off all these different areas and starting to reduce my blast radius. So back to Jed to talk a little bit about how we can apply frameworks on top of this and how we can use frameworks to help us move towards the end goal of defense in depth.
Just before I touch on this, if you guys got any questions at all, please add them to the question box and we will get to them towards the end of the session as some question and answer time. I should have said that at the beginning, so I apologise. So where do you guys fit in with patching policies? Now, most organisations will have a policy that states their patching requirements. It might be because of an external regulatory influence, or it could be your general good cyber hygiene. But let's take a good look at a couple of these influences, and I'm picking on Cyber Essentials here and PCI. Now, Cyber Essentials mandates that organizations apply critical patches within 14 days of them being released. PCI required them to be installed within 30 days of being released. Now, silly question, Tom, given what we've spoken about, but what are your thoughts of these timelines?
Again, in the old world, it probably did work, and it was probably, it fit in line with what we saw. You know, you talk about WannaCry and things like that. Yeah, it was about 30, 40 days after patch before it was widely exploited in the wild. But again, if I take WSFTP for an example, from release and POC to active exploitation was generously a couple of hours. Log4j was generously a day before that started to be exploited. MoveIt was instantaneous. So mandating certain patch requirements, I think, is an old hat way of looking at this now.
So we're looking to make the point that businesses are unique. It's down to you to determine how sophisticated your processes are based on your threat model. But to make this point, we need to talk about who is the threat to your organization and what do they do? So what is their MO of the threat? Tom, next slide.
So I've touched a little bit on these areas and who is the threat and what may be the threat, and we've talked about government and things like that, but it's a quick sort of note to bring up some of these areas. A nation state is obviously it's government. There's unlimited budget there. Ransomware gangs, depending on your definition, are or are not loosely related to nation state, but their primary MO is disruption for monetary gain and exfiltration of IP. When you start to go down towards the activist route, people aligned to a cause or saying they're aligned to a cause. Notable people in that area at the moment are Anonymous Sudan, which again may or may not be loosely related to a nation state, but their cause is for their want. They are going out and disrupting because they believe in a cause and they want to cause disruption to further their cause. You saw a lot of that activity sort of in the early 2010s with Anonymous and things like that. It's still there. You still see it. It's sort of loosely now going towards more of the opportunist level as well. But inside that list as well, you've got things like disgruntled employees, internal threats in your network, and internal sort of weaknesses there are a problem. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of hype still around GPT and its ability to write malware, or its ability to be able to write disruptive things or to tell you how to do disruptive things. It's lowered the barrier to entry 100%. I have problems with what it actually tells you, but it's still a point, right? Disgruntled employees now have access to more information on how to do things and potentially more information on different tools and techniques to be able to do things. And it again goes a little bit onto script kiddies, where there's a lot of information out there. Anyone can go online, download Kali, start Metasploit, and start firing off shells left, right, and center, and trying to use those. The barrier for entry for that is find a YouTube video online and it'll tell you how to do it. So when we look at the threat landscape and who the different actors in there, every one of these is a point that I need to be aware of. Some of these are going to have more resources than others, and some of these are going to be on the lower skilled, but by nature of them being lower skilled, they're slightly more dangerous because they will fire anything at a problem and try and get in that way. And when we see things like, SaaS solutions and things like that, the repercussions of someone firing 50, 60, 70 different attacks at one problem, if we're not patching and we're not following, you know, containerization and defense in depth and things like that, the potential impact there is quite severe. So the threat, again, I've touched on, a lot of this is compromise will lead to disruption. If you get ransomware on your estate, there is disruption. What you saw 3 years ago with some groups like Avdonia, Revil, Clop, was these gangs moving away from just ransomwaring and waiting for you to pay money, and more to a world where it's they steal data, ransomware you, and then if you don't pay up, they leak your data. And the threat there is not just the internal disruption and potential disruption to customers and things like that, but it's reputationally damaging. Potential IP has been leaked and freely given out on these websites, but also personal data. There have been numerous occasions where ransomware gangs have leaked passport scans, where they've leaked birth certificates, where they've leaked incredibly personal information from HR teams internally out on the dark web. If you looked at the MoveIt vulnerability from earlier on in the year, there was a payroll provider that was hit, which then led to compromises in many large organizations in the UK. Those organizations didn't get breached, but they had a level of reputation damage because someone in their supply chain was breached and compromised. So it's understanding what this threat looks like and understanding where those touch points are inside our estates and what are we going to do around solving them.
We're also keen to highlight that who is the threat does differ depending on the sector, depending on what you do for a business. It might be that you work for an oil company and therefore you'll be targeted by activists. It might be you work for a finance company and you're targeted by insider threat where you've got IP. So it's really important that organizations take a minute to think, okay, where is the most likely threat going to come from? And then depending on what the most likely threat is, what are they going to do? For example, a script kiddie, they will just try their luck at anything. They're very unlikely probably to steal IP, because once they've got access, they wouldn't necessarily know what to do with it. But they are likely probably to cause disruption because they'll be firing tools at your system that they don't know what they're doing. They might cause blue screens and so on. Likewise, ransomware gangs, they're very organized. They won't, I mean, they will ransom but either loss of service or data. But what they're not necessarily going to do is try to stay hidden on the network and compromise communications. That may be more nation states who are trying to use it for espionage purposes. So it might be worth, or it definitely is worth, taking a minute to think, okay, of the threat actors we've identified, which is the most likely threat actor targeting your organization? What is the threat? What are the controls you can put in place to detect that threat? Because it's not the same for everyone. It's the same different for different sectors, different sized businesses, and so on. Next slide, please, Chris. Perfect. So I want to touch back on regulation and compliance frameworks. The idea here is that we adhere to best practice, which is typically means we align to a certain standard. So we can tell our customers or tell our clients that, look, we're secure, we're aligned to ISO 27001 or NIST cybersecurity framework or Cyber Essentials or what have you. But the point here is, with the exception of Cyber Essentials in this list and PCI in this list, they don't dictate a patch policy for you. They don't say you guys need to be patched within 5 days or 10 days or 1 day. They leave it to you guys as organization, IT managers, security managers, to define your own risk and say, okay, we're X organization, turnover revenue of X amount of money, we think 5 days is appropriate to get a patch, or 1 day is appropriate to get a patch, or 15 days is appropriate to get a patch. So the point is they don't hold you accountable to a patching policy. You have to make that up yourself, and then that forms your risk profile, forms the decision that you make. You can go to the next slide, please, Tom. Even GDPR quite clearly says that, can't see the screen, but you should implement appropriate technical organization measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk. So even if you haven't got a patching policy within 10 days and your CDE gets breached or health data gets breached, and you have to file with GDPR, or so the ICO for GDPR reasons, it might not be deemed appropriate that you left it 10 days for vulnerability like MOVE to be patched. So you guys need to think about what's acceptable for your business, apply patching policies, apply defense in depth, apply these measures to see what's appropriate for your business. So this brings us to one of our last sections, applying the life cycle, the threat, and your risk appetite, and where does it all fit in? So for pen testing, again, with the exception of PCI and CE, there's little way of mandating pen testing to mitigate and highlight the level of risk. So what is appropriate? Now, most organizations will pen test everything at least once, especially internet-facing infrastructure. Some decide that their web application code changes monthly, and they consume services to test that code monthly to provide continual assurance. You've also got like threat intelligence feeds, but they're no silver bullet. Take the curl vulnerability, for example. We knew something was happening, and that was the threat intelligence that we had. But it was only 1 or 2 people that knew what it was, and nothing got leaked. So we only found out yesterday that there was nothing to it, or not much to it. But by keeping your ear to the ground, you could have had that week to identify what systems in your network might use curl if you have APIs and so on and so forth. So you're likely to hear of POX first, maybe in line with the ransomware gangs, or perhaps not. If you want to be surest, if you really have a very low risk appetite, you can then employ SAS style reverse engineers like Project Zero do. But they do spend their time reverse engineering popular software to identify reports. So for example, you can say, I know I've got move it on the external facing my infrastructure. I'm going to spend 6 months reverse engineering it, knowing it's secure. But again, there's no silver bullet either. Tom, what are the options for your risk appetite on defense in depth? So at which point is your risk 1, and therefore you deploy all the measures, and which point is your risk 10 when you deploy very little measures?
Again, I touched on it earlier, and I think you touched on it just there. It's about seeing what you're already doing, and it's about trying to understand what your internal risk appetite is, and how comfortable you are with risk. Because ultimately, no one can tell you what your risk is. Your risk is your risk. You need to be comfortable in what you own, and be comfortable with what you need to put in place. You know, budgets are shrinking, budgets are getting tighter, things are getting more expensive. It's the reality of the world. So quite often I spend a lot of time talking to people around, well, what can we do with what we've got? What can we do with what tools we have in place? What can we do with what budgets we've got in place? And it's about evaluating what is currently in place and where can we make improvements. I said about legacy antivirus, swapping that out to a newer generation, whether that's Defender for Endpoint, whether that's SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, whatever it is. You can have that conversation about moving that across. That's more visibility, that's better protection. Starting to look at things like MDR, getting all the logs in one place and centralizing them. Being able to view all of logs in one place is going to help not only in detecting threats that happen in multiple places, but also forensically being able to understand what happened in the past. And then you start going on to full segmentation. Appreciate that, again, as you go down this line, things get more expensive. People being able to maintain these systems become more expensive. So it's about understanding what you can put in place, be comfortable with what you can put in place, but also being able to build that conversation internally around, this is where I want to go, finding someone who can help you go to that, whether that's external, whether that's internal, whether that's a company like us at Clarinet, about understanding what your roadmap is and how we can help you get to the end goal of containerizing the entire network, you know, using the tools that are in place there. I talk about PIM and PAM and POR. A lot of these may already be possible with licenses you have for 365. So you can start to put those in place. You know, it's about understanding what licensing you're buying for these SaaS solutions inside your supply chain. Is there a bolt-on you can buy for security? Is there an additional thing you can put in place in security world? MFA, you know, when we start to look at things like Cyber Essentials, MFA is mandatory in a lot of these cases. So how can we lean on those compliance frameworks to help our decisions? And I think that's where I start to see the world in my defensive way moving, is not just being as simple as you take the logs and you're done. It's about understanding how we can take those logs, how we can build up a defensive profile inside the business, a defensive tool set inside the business, and overlay that with things like compliance, overlay that with things like patching, overlay that with things like supply chain management, to understand what the different areas are and how we're going to be able to handle those. Some of those come with money. Again, like Jed said, you want to go and hire the best reverse engineers possible. Cool. That's a really cool idea. Massive cost associated to that. But maybe that's your threat profile. Maybe that's your risk appetite. So it's about understanding what is reasonably acceptable, and then being able to talk you through that and get to an endpoint that makes everyone satisfied.
Cheers, Tom. So we've got a couple of quick slides left before we get on to some questions. It goes without saying, if you need help with any of this, if you need help about defense in depth, pen testing, risk, please give us a call. Next slide, please, Tom. The last point we wanted, the last point we wanted to end on is a quote from Ian Levy. He's the outgoing technical director for NCSC, the Government Department for National Cybersecurity in the UK. And he wrote a blog on the last day, and we liked the sentiment, and we thought it fit really nicely into what we're saying. It was one of the inspirations for the webinar as well, so it's only right to include it. Now, is it reasonable to ask a 10-person software company to defend themselves from the Russians? No. Is it reasonable to ask a critical infrastructure company to not have their management systems connected to the internet with a super secure password? Bloody right it is. So with that said, we'd like to spend the last maybe 5-10 minutes invite any questions that may have been asked or not. So let me pass over to Georgie, who might have some questions already.
Hi guys. We've had a couple of questions come in. You've still got time if you want to send any over, so drop them in the chat or the questions section of the boxes. But so the first one, we don't follow any frameworks currently. What would be a good starting place for us? They haven't stated the size of the company, so just do a generic.
Right. So it depends how mature your cybersecurity currently is. If it's fairly advanced and fairly secure, probably start off with something like ISO 27001. If it's fairly immature, I'd definitely go for Cyber Essentials first. I know IASME have got some frameworks that help you go from Cyber Essentials to ISO 27001. But when organizations go to bid for other pieces of work, for example, maybe a construction firm to bid for a government contract or whatever, it's very common for the supply chain to require something like ISO 27001 as a proof that the company bidding is going to look after your data fairly well. So ISO is definitely a really good target to aim for, and then maybe progress to something like NIST, which is probably more advanced.
Great, thank you. And there's another that's just come in as well. Any trends and common things that you see with some of these attacks?
So
I assume they're referring to the mentioned ones that you used.
I think there's a lot of commonalities. I think the automation side of things is the more common factor now. But then when someone gets access from one of these areas, typically they land on a box or they land with what access they've got, and then they start to enumerate. So you start to try and understand what access you've got, what can you do, how can you leverage this. That tends to be in a very similar way. It tends to be the same commands, it tends to be the same methodologies that are done. One of the things that I lean on quite a lot is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. If you don't know what the MITRE ATT&CK framework is, I thoroughly recommend going and looking at it, because it was created for this exact reason. It was created because tools can be swapped out, things can be swapped out interchangeably, but human behavior and our processes are very hard to change. So when you start to map these out and be able to understand them, you can start to spot patterns very quickly in large sets of data. So when I start to look at commonalities in these attacks and commonalities through exploitation of supply chain, they tend to follow the same things again and again and again. And it's enumeration, it's discovering where they are, lateral movement, and then exploitation, exfiltration, and then whatever the end goal may be for that particular attack.
Yeah, from my perspective, the one thing we're seeing in the last 6 months is speed, automation, probably the use of GPT in some instances. But yeah, definitely speed and automation in our attackers network is something that we see all the time now. Any more questions, Georgie?
There is one, but they've asked for it to be anonymous, so we'll share that afterwards as well. And anybody else that has any questions that you've not had a chance to, or you think about later, anything like that, I'll be sending out an email with the recording of this and the slides that the guys have gone through anyway. So if you have any of them, either reply to that email or just get in touch directly.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you for your time. We'll let you know if there's more webinars, and it'll be bye from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.